All right. This is now Civil Rights 3, picking up where we left off, 1949 more or less. The big deal here is the Brown decision in 1954 and the challenge and the backlash that the southern states had with it. And so we're going to see all those, okay? Now, this is all completely new material, hopefully, and so we'll see how this works. Now, in 1954, Linda Brown, a little schoolgirl seen here, is going to become the focal picture of segregation. Is segregation against this little girl who knows no different? Is it right? Is it right to send her past all these schools to a school of her own race that is not receiving adequate funding or as much funding as other schools? The Supreme Court, in a massive decision, decides no, it is not. And so segregation is finally struck down, but only in educational purposes. So Jim Crow laws still exist, but this is kind of a beginning, because now the NAACP, who is in charge of the court case here, can begin to whittle away at the other aspects of separate equal and wanting, ultimately, a Civil Rights Act passed by a president. However, that Civil Rights Act doesn't come until 10 years later. Some more things have to occur. Now, the man who argued for Linda Brown and against segregation, his name was Thurgood Marshall. His title was the head of the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, head lawyer, okay? Later in life, he will become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. And so, very influential there. We've actually only had two African-American Supreme Court justices, him and another man I'll talk about in the 90s by the name of Clarence Thomas. And that's just chaotic, what happens there. Now, the nail in the coffin, what ultimately decides this was a groundbreaking psychological experiment by a husband and wife team. The big guy was the Dr. Kenneth Clark, and we call this the doll test. And Thurgood Marshall used this to prove what separate but equal had done. So, Kenneth Clark and his wife Mamie, they took two dolls, one white, one black. They left them in the room, and they would ask the questions that you see here. First off, they would say, "Show me the doll that you like the best, or the one you'd like to play with." Then they would ask, "Show me which one is the nice doll. Show me which doll looks bad. Show me the doll that looks like a white child. Show me the doll that looks like a colored child. Give me the one that looks like a black child. Give me the doll that looks like you." And so all of these things came out, and the groundbreaking decision was more than half of these little kids, I'm not talking about adults, I'm talking little kids, elementary, identified with the opposite race doll because they saw their own selves as being inferior, and so they didn't want to recognize their own race. That's a problem. There's no pride, there's no nationalism, and so they've created this mindset that I am inferior. I'm less than everybody else, and that can never happen, okay? So this is the big case. I'll show you a video about this. They redid this once Barack Obama was elected, and there's some cool things. There's headlines that come out of that. And so we'll look at those later on in class, all right? Now, throughout the South, after the Brown decision, there were groups that said, you know, we don't want to integrate. And these groups later became known as White Citizens Councils. Sometimes they just called themselves Citizen Council of America. How can we tell them apart from the Klan? Because, yes, they are a hate group. White Citizens Councils did not have, per se, meetings. They might have had smaller little get-togethers and picnics and whatever. They didn't have robes or any type of identification, so they blended in really well. But these are the ones who started riots and did many assassinations. In some other circles, they've kind of called them night riders as well. And so the night riders and the White Citizens Council responsible for a lot of death in this era here of the 50s and 60s, all right? Now in 1955, we have the tragic story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young boy from Chicago, came down to Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi, in fact. And as the story goes, a woman felt like he had catcalled at her, catcalled, right? Um, some members of white citizens councils, Klan, whatever, um, they went to his home, drug him out. They will murder him, and they will hide his body. Now, when all of this comes to fruition, and they have the ultimate thing, his mother, and you can see the bottom picture there, requested an open casket. And it's ghastly seeing how the boy on the top of that picture was alive and full of life, and yet at the bottom one, it doesn't even look like him. But she wanted people to see what racism would cause. Now, the big deal here, they called this the wolf whistle jury. The men who were accused of this were ultimately set free, citing that it was hearsay, that they couldn't tell if it was them who did this or etc. And again, that makes people upset. All right. Now, also in 1955, we have the Rosa Parks story. Rosa Parks lived in Montgomery, Alabama. She boarded a bus, which the bus was a segregated bus. She sat down in the front, seeing an empty seat. Along the line, a white passenger came and wanted that seat. The Jim Crow law rule in Montgomery, Alabama, and in fact a lot of states, was African Americans had to move to the back of the bus. That's where we get the Outkast made a song about that, Rosa Parks. Push that pull, everybody move to the back of the bus. That was about Rosa Parks. Anywho, so Rosa Parks later in life said, I wasn't trying to do anything. However, I did believe in civil disobedience. I'd heard about it, and so I refused to give up my seat. So as you can see here, she will be arrested for Jim Crow disobedience of Jim Crow, etc., inciting a riot. That's their favorite things. Okay. While in jail, she meets another woman who had been kind of doing this, named Joanne Robinson. And she's telling her story to Joanne Robinson, and Joanne Robinson and Rosa Parks, while in jail, come up with the concept of a bus boycott. Now, remember, a boycott, like the grape growers boycott, is highly successful because it is an economic boycott. It hits people where it matters the most, in their pocketbook. So, if you can do this correctly, you're going to ultimately hurt their bottom line. They're not going to make money. So, around Christmas time, in Montgomery, Alabama, they stopped using the buses. And African Americans made up a large majority of the people who made the buses. And by the end, kind of getting closer to Christmas and into 1956, Montgomery caves, and they will become one of the first cities to integrate their buses. So the bus boycott wins. Okay. Now in 1956, we're now 2 years removed from Brown. And what happened is the South is not integrating. So they have a lesser-known court case called Brown versus the Board 2, or simply Brown 2. Now, the whole thing is we're trying to see, is the South following orders? Are they integrating? And they make a tactical error. They're wanting this to pick up, but the wording used can be construed and is actually going to cause more problems. And I'll tell you why. So the wording was, all Southern institutions, public institutions, must integrate with all deliberate speed. My definition of deliberate speed as I'm walking down the hall, and your definition of deliberate speed when you're walking down the hall, are vastly different. I have someplace to be. I'm walking. You, talking, having a good time, making sure I'm not going to be tardy. I may pick it up eventually. But deliberate does not have a set definition. Deliberate simply means I'm meaning to do it. So the South is going to use this, and a lot of these schools are going to go, okay, deliberate speed means I'm going to go with a transitionary period, over time, all of these things, okay? And so this is really important because they're hoping that the people would simply give up, right? Now, Again, Strom Thurmond, that Dixiecrat guy we talked about in the 40s, he comes back in the 50s. He actually stayed as a South Carolina senator for many years. And he is going to sign the Southern Manifesto. The Southern Manifesto basically is going to promote states' rights when it comes to education and says you can't tell us what to do. You cannot tell us to integrate. Now, the law said you must integrate. The South says no. We're heading for a major conflict here, right? Major conflict. And that's an important one. We'll get it in a second. Now, back in Montgomery in 1956, they said the bus boycott worked out so good, let's go to improve the whole city of Montgomery. So the Montgomery Improvement Association is formed with the goal of removing Jim Crow aspects in the whole city. Joanne Robinson, Rosa Parks felt that a woman would have a lot more difficulty leading this. So they chose as their director, president of the MIA, a young, fairly well-known preacher from Montgomery by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. And this is where he pops on the scene. And so the Montgomery Improvement Association was so successful that we have improvement associations popping up all in the South, in Memphis, in Albany, Georgia, in Atlanta, in Anniston, Alabama, in Selma, Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, in Texas, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I could keep going, but I'm not. So they start popping up, all these places, okay? It is in 1957 Dr. King says, okay, we're not accomplishing much. We're worried about all the things we need to unite. This is our third of the big six programs, our big protests. So NAACP, CORE, number 3, SCLC. We call it the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, if you notice, the button has a black and white hand. Again, it is an interracial group. They feel that it's necessary. Now, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is simply taking all those improvement associations and combining them into one. The man in charge would be Dr. King. Now, why Christian? He's going to use these Christian principles we've talked about much earlier on. I mean, that was his occupation. He was a preacher, and so that's what he's got to base it on, okay? Now, if you remember, I said the law said you must integrate. They're not doing it at this point, so we're forcing an issue. NAACP went to Little Rock, Arkansas, and they wanted to find 9 African-American students who lived in a school district they were supposed to integrate in and challenge the Southern Manifesto. Basically, we want to create a problem to see what the federal government will do. Will they let the state just continue with integration, or will they step in and force them? These 9 African-American students in U.S. history are nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Okay? So here's the story of Little Rock Nine. Thurgood Marshall, NAACP, they get these 9 together. They're training them. They're saying they're going to spit at you. They're going to do these horrible things. You can't retaliate. You got to just stay focused, okay? They announce they're going to enter the school, all right? Now, the governor of Arkansas, not the mayor, but the governor, was a man named Orville Favis. His famous quote was, "No one will remember Dr. King, but I will be famous as Favis." That's backwards. Anyway, Favis came up with an idea for a bill, and the bill was to prevent the integration of Arkansas schools, and in particular, Little Rock schools. Okay? So, all of these things are looking bad, correct? And in fact, the mayor of Little Rock said, it's getting A1 crazy, you've got to act, you've got to get down here, etc. Now, the Little Rock Nine incident and resolution. As they are trying to integrate the school, Orville Favis, by power, will send out the state militia. We call it the National Guard. And Arkansas's National Guard was put in front of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, to prevent 9 African-American students from attending a school that they were supposed to go to. That is the incident, okay? As they're doing this, the crowd is there, white citizen council are there, they're throwing stuff at them, they're shouting, they're spitting, and the mayor writes to the president and says, the mob riot is getting worse. I don't know if I can contain it. I've got to have your backing. So, Eisenhower seeing that. Now, Eisenhower, don't get me wrong, I don't think he was anti-civil rights, but he's worried about other things. Remember, in the 50s, we're Cold War, we're mad, we're brinkmanship, we're about to blow each other up. So what he does is he will send out the 101st Division of the Airborne U.S. Army to integrate. So we have a state National Guard Army versus a federal Army. Going back to a concept we established way early on, when there's a conflict between federal and state, who wins out? When there's a conflict between father and son, who wins out? The father, the federal. When the Army shows up, those National Guard troops must disperse, and they do. So the federal troops will escort, as you see here, escorting some of the Little Rock Nine into classes. However, they were still treated badly and shoved in lockers, and they urinated on their lockers. They put thumbtacks on their chair. They dumped chili on their head. There's all kinds of things. In class, we're going to actually look at a really kind of heartwarming video about later on some people trying to make amends for their actions, and it's an interesting video. So this is the first time that a governor has challenged a ruling of the federal government since the Civil War. Massive decision here, right? But what do we learn? We learn that the federal government will act if you do not listen to the law. And even though they're not, maybe not in so much, if you do not listen to the law, they will act and they'll send down troops. Okay? But it has to happen again. Now, that same year, Eisenhower will sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The big deal of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was to prevent another Brown or another Little Rock Nine thing from occurring. Basically, he said, guys, you got to integrate schools. You got to do what the federal government is saying. I really don't care one way or the other, but I don't want to have to keep getting involved with the military. It makes us look weak. So that's the whole purpose here. Now, the next video, number 4, we go 1958. I believe it's 1963 at this point, and that's where it really gets interesting and picking up, okay? So, there's that one.